welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today is part one of a two-parter series talking about best practices for dealing with patterns that have multiple colorways in them. So first of all, what do I mean by multiple colorways? Multiple colorway pattern is one where you take one base design and you start changing either the number of fabrics or the variety of fabrics, placement of fabrics in order to get a different effect. So you might have, a basic design, maybe you've got a 1-color version or a 3-color version or an ombré version or something along those lines, fat quarter version, different pre-cut versions. So you take this one design and then by changing up the number of fabrics and their placement, you can get a different effect with it. And generally what this ends up meaning for your pattern is that you have different cutting instructions for each colorway and then also sometimes different assembly methods used for each colorway. Now, these patterns can be a little bit challenging because there tends to be a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot going on in these patterns, and that's why frequently they end up being really, really long and really disorganized, really difficult to follow. So we're going to be talking about some tips to try and avoid that, to keep them as organized as possible. So even if you're offering multiple options, it's still really seamless and easy for your reader to follow. First things first. Don't repeat info if you can. Like I said, a lot of times there's going to be different cutting instructions depending on the colorway that you're making, but frequently you'll end up with a couple of fabrics that remain the same. Frequently this is like a background fabric, right? And it's going to be the same for all of the versions. And if that's the case, just list it once. The tendency is to kind of have all of your cutting instructions and all of your fabric requirements listed multiple times. So you'd have a complete set listed for, the 1-color option, and then you'd have that complete set again for like the 3-color option or the fat quarter option, whatever options you happen to be offering in your pattern. But the background fabric's really not different, right? It's the same requirement no matter which colorway you're working with, and the cutting instructions don't change. So you've just completely repeated all of this information multiple times in your pattern. Not only does that take up space, but it also kind of introduces this opportunity for confusion because now the reader's got to sit there and go, which one do I follow? I'm not really sure. They're all the same, so it doesn't really matter, but it's just this repeated information that's unnecessary. So if you can, just avoid it. Now, sometimes different colorways, you're actually going to have slightly different background cutting instructions. And if that's the case in your pattern, obviously this isn't going to work, but we'll talk about that case in just a minute. The next tip is to make sure that you cut all of your pieces the same way, regardless of the colorway. So specifically, this is with regards to precuts. If you're using like fat quarters, fat ace, layer cakes, charm packs, something along those lines, you don't want to be separating those into multiple stacks and cutting some fat quarters this way and some fat quarters another way. It just gets really, really confusing really fast. So if you're going to be offering kind of multiple colorways where you're offering these pre-cut options, make it so that, one entire grouping of fabrics is represented by those fat quarters, and you're taking your stack of fat quarters and you're cutting them down all exactly the same way to make your blocks. Same thing is true for like layer cakes or charmed squares, whatever it happens to be in your pattern. You don't want to be separating out, 5 charm squares for fabric A and 10 for fabric B and 25 for fabric C, and fabric A ones get cut this way and the fabric B ones get cut a different way and the fabric C ones get cut. Like, it just gets out of control really fast. And generally when you're using pre-cuts, there's a lot of variety. It's going to end up looking more scrappy anyways. So there's no real reason to kind of separate out those different fabrics by pre-cut and having all those cutting instructions cut differently. Just cut all of your pieces from one kind of set. If you happen to be using fat quarters, I really encourage you to kind of try to get all of the pieces needed for X number of blocks on each fat quarter so that you're just kind of cutting multiples of those things regardless of the size and regardless of the colorway. If you happen to be looking for more tips on dealing with fat quarters and quilt patterns, make sure you check out my video on using fat quarters and quilt patterns. All right, the next tip is to group all of the information into blocks. So let's get back to that point that I was talking about earlier, where you have different background cutting instructions depending on which colorway that you're using. Perhaps you're using strip piecing and you've got a fat quarter option, and now your strips are half the width of fabric that they used to be. Now you have to kind of accommodate for that with your background fabrics. And so in that case, what I encourage you to do is kind of have all of the information grouped together for the fat quarter version, including the background cutting instructions. Keep that all together, and then have all of the information for the yardage instructions in a different location. Oftentimes that's a different page, sometimes it's not. But what you don't want to do is have background yardage, background fat quarters, and then fat quarter cutting instructions and yardage cutting instructions for the rest of your fabrics, because then it's really easy to kind of get confused as to which background fabric cutting instructions you're paying attention to, especially if these are spread across multiple pages. and people are kind of scrolling back and forth or flipping back and forth in between all of these pages, it's really easy to accidentally end up on the wrong cutting table. And if you do that and you cut your fabric wrong, oftentimes there's no going back and you just have to buy more fabric, which sucks. So making sure that you kind of keep everything grouped together. And this goes for instructions as well. If you have certain assembly instructions that only apply to certain colorways, make sure you kind of group all of those together so that they know, okay, I've just got to go to this section and this section all applies to me, and I can ignore all of the other sections safely. I don't have to worry about kind of making sure that I'm paying attention to the right instructions and flipping through the pattern to make sure that I found all the instructions that apply to my version. The last tip that I have is to try and limit yourself to 3 or 4 options or less. This is one that I will die on, and you've heard me talk about it frequently on this channel if you are a fan. Sometimes less is more. Oftentimes we want to give all of this optionality, and when we're designing, you like to get creative and you're like, what would it look like if I did this colorway, if I had 5 colors, if I had 8 colors, if I did an ombré, like all of these things that I can think of, and it's really super exciting and you get really attached to it. But you are not writing a pattern for yourself, you're writing for your reader, and that's really all that matters. What is going to help them follow it the easiest? And if you have included so many friggin' colorways that it's impossible to follow and this thing's 40 pages long and it's just really a nightmare to make, you've gone too far. You need to pare it back, right? Less is more. So 3 to 4 options is generally where that's capped, but it depends on how complicated these different colorways are. If each one's very involved, your assembly instructions differ quite a bit between the 2 versions, you're probably going to want to limit yourself to just 2 versions. If it's just the cutting instructions and all of the assembly instructions are exactly the same regardless of which version you're making, maybe 3 or 4 is okay, but don't go over 4. It just gets to be too much at that point. You don't need to offer a layer cake version and a charm pack version and a fat quarter and a fat eighth and all of these different versions. Pare it down, limit yourself just a little bit. It will make this a much more pleasant experience for your reader, which is the whole point, guys. It's the whole point. Alrighty, that's all I've got for you today. I will be back next time with part 2 of the series. We'll be talking about very specific guidelines for the actual instructions and guts of your pattern, because there is a lot to unpack when you have multiple colorways in your pattern. Alrighty, if you found this video helpful, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you next time for Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya!